On February 4th, 1963, in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, a massive tanker loaded with molten sulfur was moving slowly through rough seas when it vanished without a single distress call. No mayday, no emergency transmission, no final plea for help. The SS Marine Sulphur Queen simply stopped existing. 39 men disappeared with it, including Captain John C. McClelland, a veteran mariner who had crossed these waters countless times. The last radio contact was calm, almost routine. Hours later, silence swallowed the ship whole. Days later, the ocean began returning pieces of something that should not have fallen apart the way it did. Twisted metal, scattered debris, no bodies, no lifeboats, no clear explanation. Investigators would later admit something unsettling. The wreckage could not be explained by a single explosion, storm, or structural failure. And even more disturbing, this ship never asked for help. In a sea filled with radio traffic, SOS signals, and emergency protocols, the Marine Sulphur Queen vanished as if it had been erased. What happened during those final hours? Why did no one speak up? And why does this mystery of the disappearance still resist every logical answer more than 6 decades later? When search planes finally reached the coordinates of the tanker's last transmission, they didn't find oil slicks or lifeboats. They found sulfur-stained debris drifting miles apart, as if the ship had been torn open from the inside, slowly, violently, and unevenly. Some fragments showed heat damage, others showed none at all. Experts disagreed. Theories contradicted each other. And then came a detail quietly buried in official reports. Several ships had passed near the Marine Sulphur Queen that night, close enough to hear a distress call if one had been sent. But none was received. No explosion was heard. No signal intercepted. It was as if whatever happened unfolded in silence, and if the ship didn't call for help, was it unable to? Or was something already wrong long before it vanished? The mystery of the disappearance of the SS Marine Sulphur Queen does not begin with a storm, nor with panic, nor with an explosion echoing across the Gulf of Mexico. It begins with something far more disturbing: normality. In early February of 1963, the tanker was doing exactly what it had been designed to do: transport a dangerous cargo across familiar waters under the command of an experienced captain. There was no warning issued to other vessels, no unusual alerts from maritime authorities, no sense, at least on paper, that the ship was moving toward disaster. And yet, within a narrow window of time, the Marine Sulphur Queen would vanish so completely that even today, investigators are forced to reconstruct its final hours from fragments, assumptions, and silence. The ship itself was already a contradiction. Originally built as an oil tanker during World War II, it had been radically converted to carry molten sulfur, a substance that demanded constant heating and precise containment. This transformation raised concerns long before the vessel ever disappeared. Engineers questioned the structural integrity. Inspectors noted unusual stress points. Crew members reportedly expressed discomfort with the ship's behavior at sea. But the tanker kept sailing, trip after trip, as if daring the ocean to expose its weaknesses. By 1963, the Marine Sulphur Queen was a floating question mark, operational, functional, yet shadowed by unresolved doubts. At the center of this final voyage stood Captain John C. McClelland. He was not reckless. He was not inexperienced. His reputation was built on discipline and caution, the kind of man who followed procedure and respected the sea. That is precisely why his silence matters. When a captain like McClelland doesn't send a distress call, the implications are chilling. It suggests either an event so sudden that no response was possible, or a situation unfolding so strangely that no one recognized it as an emergency until it was too late. What followed the disappearance only deepened the mystery. The Gulf of Mexico, vast but heavily trafficked, should have yielded answers quickly. Instead, it offered confusion. Wreckage appeared days later, scattered across hundreds of miles. Some pieces hinted at extreme heat. Others showed no signs of fire at all. The distribution made no sense. It did not resemble the aftermath of a single catastrophic explosion, nor did it match the signature of a ship broken apart by weather alone. There were no bodies, no lifeboats, no final transmissions recovered, just fragments, physical and narrative, that refused to align. As authorities launched investigations, their conclusions shifted, softened, and contradicted each other. Official language became cautious, almost evasive. Terms like probable cause replaced definitive answers, and slowly the case was closed, not because it was solved, but because it resisted resolution. The mystery of the disappearance of the SS Marine Sulphur Queen was quietly archived, even as the questions surrounding it grew heavier with time. More than 6 decades later, the tanker's final voyage remains one of the most unsettling maritime enigmas ever recorded. Not because of what we know, but because of what was never said, never transmitted, and never found. And to understand how a ship can vanish without a sound, we must return to the last moment when the Marine Sulphur Queen was still visible, still moving, still alive on the water. The last time the SS Marine Sulphur Queen was seen, there was nothing dramatic about it. No alarms, no urgency in the captain's voice, no indication that 39 men were standing at the edge of oblivion. On February 4th, 1963, the tanker was making its routine passage from Beaumont, Texas to Norfolk, Virginia, cutting through the Gulf of Mexico under conditions that, while uncomfortable, were far from extraordinary for a vessel of its size. The seas were rough, the winds persistent, but not uncommon for winter in those waters. To seasoned mariners like Captain John C. McClelland, this was familiar territory. The final confirmed communication came through standard radio channels. The transmission was brief, controlled, and almost forgettable. The ship reported its position, its speed, and its course. Nothing more. No mention of mechanical trouble. No reference to cargo instability. No hint that the tanker was experiencing structural stress or internal failures. It was the kind of message that barely registered among the constant chatter of maritime traffic. And yet, it would become the last recorded trace of the Marine Sulphur Queen, while it was still intact. What makes this moment so unsettling is not just what was said, but what wasn't. Captains are trained to err on the side of caution. Even minor concerns are often logged, shared, or hinted at in coded language familiar to other seafarers. But there were no such signals, no change in tone, no deviation from procedure. The crew continued their watches. The engines pushed forward. The sulfur cargo remained heated, contained, and, at least officially, stable. Other vessels were moving through the Gulf that same night, some within radio range. None reported unusual sounds, no flashes on the horizon, no shockwaves rolling across the water. If the Marine Sulphur Queen had exploded violently, someone should have noticed. If it had broken apart in a storm, debris should have appeared quickly and in a concentrated area. Instead, the ship seemed to pass from existence between routine check-ins, slipping into the dark, without leaving a disturbance large enough to be immediately recognized. The last visual sightings were just as ordinary. Navigation lights glowing against black water, a silhouette cutting through waves. To any passing observer, it would have looked like another tanker enduring another night at sea. There was no farewell moment, no dramatic final image. Just a working ship moving steadily forward, commanded by a man who had no reason to believe this voyage would be his last. This ordinary ending to visibility is what haunts the mystery of the disappearance. Disasters usually announce themselves. They demand attention. They break the rhythm of routine. But the Marine Sulphur Queen did none of that. It followed the script of normal operations right up until the moment it didn't. And whatever happened after that point occurred in a narrow window, after the last calm transmission and before anyone realized the ship was overdue. To understand what could silence an entire vessel so completely, we must trace what happened next. Not through eyewitnesses, but through timestamps, gaps, and the chilling absence of communication that followed the last time Captain McClelland's ship was seen. The mystery of the disappearance deepens when the timeline is laid out, because the SS Marine Sulphur Queen did not vanish in chaos. It vanished in the space between routine events. After the final radio transmission on February 4, 1963, the tanker continued along a projected course that placed it squarely within one of the most monitored maritime corridors in the Gulf of Mexico. According to navigation estimates, the ship should have reached its next reporting point without incident. Instead, time began to stretch, and nothing came through. Hour by hour, the silence grew heavier. Radio operators logged the absence but did not immediately panic. Ships miss check-ins, signals fade, weather interferes. In the maritime world, a few lost hours are not unusual, but as the night turned into morning and morning into afternoon, the absence became impossible to ignore. The Marine Sulphur Queen was no longer just quiet, it was missing. Weather reports from the period described strong winds and heavy seas, but nothing approaching a storm capable of instantly destroying a 524-foot tanker. Waves were high, yes, but not unprecedented. Winds were aggressive, but not abnormal. The sea, by all measurable accounts, was hostile but survivable. This matters because it narrows the window of what could have happened. If the ship was compromised, it likely wasn't by a single, overwhelming environmental force. Navigation models suggest that sometime during the early hours of February 4th, the tanker either slowed dramatically or ceased moving altogether, but there was no corresponding transmission to explain why. No report of engine failure, no alert regarding cargo instability, no request for assistance. The ship's track simply ends, as if someone drew a line across the ocean and erased everything beyond it. Investigators later attempted to reconstruct these missing hours using indirect data: last known speed, fuel consumption, prevailing currents, and drift patterns of recovered debris. What emerged was not a clear sequence of events, but a series of overlapping possibilities. The ship could have suffered internal structural failure, unfolding gradually and silently. It could have experienced a cascading malfunction in its sulfur heating system, creating conditions that incapacitated the crew before they understood the danger. Or it could have been struck by a sequence of events so rapid and disorienting that no one reached the radio in time. What complicates the chronology further is the lack of secondary evidence. No radar pings, no emergency flares, no oil slick detected in the immediate aftermath. Even ships that passed near the estimated location reported nothing unusual. The Gulf did not behave like a crime scene. It behaved like nothing had happened at all. This absence forces a disturbing conclusion. Whatever destroyed the Marine Sulphur Queen likely unfolded in stages, not in a single explosive moment. It suggests confusion rather than panic, disruption rather than instant annihilation. The timeline does not scream disaster. It whispers it, leaving behind just enough gaps to prevent certainty. By the time the ship was officially declared overdue, the critical window for understanding those final hours had already closed. The sea had moved on. The currents had scattered any remaining traces, and the mystery of the disappearance entered its most frustrating phase. Not the moment of loss, but the delay in realizing that something had gone terribly wrong. The first alerts regarding the SS Marine Sulphur Queen did not arrive with urgency or alarm. They arrived quietly, buried in routine procedures, almost hesitant to acknowledge that something might be wrong. When the tanker failed to make its expected report, there was no immediate assumption of disaster. In maritime operations, delays are common, especially in winter seas. Weather interferes, radios fail, schedules slip. For a ship that had shown no signs of distress, silence was inconvenient but not yet alarming. Hours passed before concern began to take shape. Communication attempts were repeated. Frequencies were checked and rechecked. Other vessels in the Gulf were asked, informally at first, if they had seen or heard from the tanker. The responses came back empty. No sightings, no transmissions, no anomalies reported. The absence was subtle but persistent, and that persistence slowly shifted the tone from routine delay to uneasy uncertainty. By the time authorities formally acknowledged that the Marine Sulphur Queen was overdue, valuable time had already been lost. This delay would later become one of the most criticized aspects of the case. Because the ship carried molten sulfur, a hazardous cargo that required constant management, any prolonged loss of communication should have triggered immediate concern. Yet procedures were followed by the book, not by instinct, and the book did not account for a ship that could vanish without warning. As alerts escalated, the language remained cautious. There were no emergency bulletins broadcast across the Gulf. No immediate mayday relays issued on behalf of the missing vessel. Instead, notifications were framed as inquiries. Had anyone seen the tanker? Had any ship detected debris? Had any unusual signals been intercepted during the night? Each unanswered question tightened the knot at the center of the mystery of the disappearance. Families of the crew were not informed right away. Shipping companies and authorities moved carefully, aware of the implications of declaring a vessel missing too soon. But this caution carried a cost. Every hour that passed allowed currents to disperse potential evidence, to erase patterns that might have explained what happened. By the time a broader alert was issued, the Gulf of Mexico had already begun to rearrange the scene. When the Coast Guard finally initiated formal protocols, the situation had crossed a threshold. The Marine Sulphur Queen was no longer late. It was unaccounted for. The absence of a distress call now loomed large. Officials were forced to confront a troubling reality. If the ship had encountered trouble, it either could not call for help or did not recognize the danger in time. Both possibilities pointed toward a failure that was sudden, confusing, or internal. The first alerts marked the transition from routine oversight to full uncertainty. They were the moment when silence became evidence. And as the search was prepared, a realization began to take hold among investigators. A realization that whatever had happened to the Marine Sulphur Queen, it had unfolded without witnesses, without warnings, and without leaving behind a clear starting point. The mystery of the disappearance was no longer theoretical. It was active, expanding, and already slipping beyond reach. When the official search for the SS Marine Sulphur Queen finally began, it did so under a cloud of uncertainty that no amount of manpower could immediately dispel. Coast Guard vessels were dispatched across a broad swath of the Gulf of Mexico, joined by Navy aircraft scanning the water from above. The mission was clear in theory: locate the missing tanker, rescue survivors, recover evidence. But in practice, the search quickly revealed how little there was to find. Initial expectations were shaped by precedent. Ships that sink leave signatures, oil slicks spread across the surface, lifeboats drift, personal effects appear, radios transmit weak, broken signals. None of these appeared in the first critical days. Aircraft flew low over rolling seas and reported nothing but open water. The Gulf looked undisturbed, as if no vessel had ever passed through the coordinates where the Marine Sulphur Queen was last known to be. It was only days later that the ocean began to release fragments. Pieces of wreckage surfaced far from one another, carried by currents that made reconstruction difficult. Some debris bore traces of sulfur residue. Other fragments showed heat distortion, warped metal that suggested exposure to extreme temperatures. Yet many pieces appeared oddly intact, untouched by fire or violent rupture. This contradiction baffled investigators. A single explosion could not account for such varied conditions, nor could a gradual sinking explain the wide dispersion. The search area expanded rapidly, stretching hundreds of miles. Each new fragment raised more questions than it answered. There were no lifeboats recovered, no bodies, no clear indication that anyone had attempted to abandon ship. This absence forced a grim possibility into focus. The crew may never have had the chance. Whatever happened to the tanker may have incapacitated it and everyone aboard before standard emergency procedures could even begin. Search coordinators were faced with an uncomfortable truth. The longer the operation continued, the less likely it was to produce clarity. Currents shifted daily, storm systems moved through, potential evidence degraded with every passing hour. The Gulf of Mexico is vast, and once it begins to scatter debris, patterns dissolve quickly. By the time enough wreckage was recovered to confirm the ship's loss, the original scene was already gone. Despite the scale of the effort, the official search concluded without resolution. The Marine Sulphur Queen was declared lost with all hands. The conclusion was administrative, not explanatory. It acknowledged absence, not cause. The ocean had returned just enough material to prove the ship was gone, but not enough to explain how or why. This phase of the mystery of the disappearance left investigators with a paradox. Physical evidence existed, yet it resisted interpretation. The search had found proof of destruction without revealing the mechanism behind it. And as the operation wound down, attention shifted from rescue to analysis, toward theories that would attempt to fill the gaps left behind by the sea. As the search ended and the reality of total loss settled in, investigators turned to theory, an attempt to impose order on a mystery of the disappearance that refused to align with precedent. The first explanations were practical, almost reassuring in their familiarity. Severe weather, structural failure, cargo-related explosion. Each theory offered a way to close the case without confronting deeper uncertainties. But one by one, they began to unravel. The weather theory was the simplest. The Gulf of Mexico had been rough that night, with high winds and heavy seas. Some suggested the tanker had been overwhelmed, its structure compromised by relentless wave action. But maritime records quickly complicated this explanation. Other vessels in the area reported no catastrophic conditions. Ships smaller than the Marine Sulphur Queen passed through safely. The sea was hostile, but not exceptional. It could stress a ship, but not erase it without a trace or warning. Attention then shifted to the ship itself. The Marine Sulphur Queen had long been criticized for its design. Converted from an oil tanker, it carried molten sulfur in heated tanks that exerted unusual stress on the hull. Investigators considered the possibility of structural fatigue, a slow, internal failure that caused the ship to break apart. But this raised a troubling question. Why was there no distress call? Structural failure is rarely silent. It announces itself with leaks, alarms, vibrations. Captains report it, crews react, yet nothing was transmitted. The explosion theory carried the most dramatic weight. Molten sulfur is volatile under certain conditions, capable of producing toxic gases and extreme heat. A sudden ignition could explain the ship's destruction, but the recovered wreckage contradicted this idea. The damage was inconsistent. Some fragments showed signs of intense heat, while others showed none at all. A single explosion would have left a more uniform signature. This looked uneven, fragmented in stages, not obliterated in one instant. Some experts proposed a chain reaction, a small failure triggering another, cascading through the ship before anyone understood what was happening. This theory accounted for the silence, suggesting the crew was incapacitated before they could respond. But it remained speculative, unsupported by direct evidence. Without bodies, without the ship's core structure, even the most sophisticated models remained guesswork. As theories multiplied, none achieved consensus. Each explained part of the evidence while contradicting another. Investigators began to speak in probabilities rather than conclusions. Official reports grew cautious, hedged with qualifiers and uncertainty. The mystery of the disappearance was no longer about choosing the right explanation. It was about accepting that no single theory could fully explain what had been found. And in that uncertainty, a deeper unease took root. If conventional explanations failed, then something about the Marine Sulphur Queen, its design, its cargo, or the sequence of events that night, fell outside the boundaries of normal maritime disasters. The ship hadn't just sunk, it had defied expectation. And that realization opened the door to questions that would grow darker as the investigation continued. The deeper investigators looked into the wreckage of the SS Marine Sulphur Queen, the more the physical evidence began to contradict itself. This was not the aftermath of a single clean catastrophe. It was a puzzle made of fragments that seemed to belong to different disasters entirely, and that contradiction sits at the core of the mystery of the disappearance. Some recovered pieces were twisted and warped, bearing signs of extreme heat. Metal that should have bent under pressure appeared scorched, deformed, as if exposed to temperatures far beyond what the surrounding sea could produce. These fragments suggested fire, possibly internal, possibly sustained. Yet other pieces told a completely different story. They showed no burn marks, no deformation, no evidence of explosive force. They looked as if they had simply broken free and drifted away. Even more unsettling was the pattern of distribution. Debris was found scattered across hundreds of miles, inconsistent with a localized explosion or a single sinking event. Oceanographers tried to model the drift, but the timelines didn't match. Some pieces appeared too far apart to have originated from one moment in time. It suggested a ship coming apart gradually, shedding pieces long before the final loss. Yet no one had noticed. Sulfur residue added another layer of confusion. Molten sulfur solidifies quickly when exposed to seawater, and its presence on debris confirmed the cargo's involvement. But there was no uniform coating, no consistent spread. Some fragments were heavily contaminated, others were clean. This unevenness implied compartmentalized failures, isolated events happening in different parts of the ship, possibly at different times. Then there was what wasn't found. No lifeboats, no emergency equipment, no personal effects that usually surface after a sinking. Even in the most violent maritime disasters, something recognizable remains. Here, the absence was total. It was as if the crew had been removed from the narrative entirely, leaving behind only structural remains that refused to explain their fate. Investigators were forced to confront an uncomfortable possibility. The evidence did not support a human response. There were no signs of evacuation, no signals of attempted survival. Whatever happened to the Marine Sulphur Queen may have rendered the crew incapable of acting, either through rapid incapacitation or through a failure that unfolded invisibly until it was irreversible. This evidence was labeled inconclusive in official summaries, but among experts it was quietly referred to as impossible, not because it defied physics, but because it defied pattern. Maritime disasters follow rules, they leave signatures. This one did not. Each recovered fragment seemed to argue with the others, as if the ship had experienced multiple endings instead of one. The impossible evidence did not solve the mystery of the disappearance. It destabilized it, and in doing so, it shifted attention away from the ship itself and toward those responsible for explaining its loss. Authorities whose responses would soon raise questions as troubling as the wreckage scattered across the Gulf. As the investigation into the SS Marine Sulphur Queen progressed, a different kind of evidence began to stand out. Not what was found, but what was withheld. Official reports were published, but their language was restrained, carefully calibrated, and notably vague. Conclusions were framed as probabilities. Responsibility was dispersed. No single cause was identified. And quietly, the case was allowed to fade from public attention. This institutional quiet became part of the mystery of the disappearance itself. Maritime authorities acknowledged design concerns with the vessel, but stopped short of assigning blame. Engineering flaws were mentioned, then softened by phrases like contributing factors. Cargo risks were discussed but never fully explored. The absence of a distress call, arguably the most disturbing aspect of the case, was treated as an unfortunate detail rather than a central anomaly. There was no aggressive push to explain how an entire crew could be silenced so completely. Some documents were delayed, others were summarized rather than released in full. Technical appendices were condensed. Recommendations were issued for future ship designs, subtly implying that lessons had been learned without openly stating what those lessons were. To outside observers, it felt less like transparency and more like containment. Families of the crew were given little more than condolences and conclusions they could not verify. There were no remains to bury, no definitive explanation to accept. Questions about safety inspections, prior incidents, and internal complaints were met with bureaucratic language. The tone was sympathetic but closed. The door to deeper inquiry remained firmly shut. Within maritime circles, this silence was noticed, not discussed publicly but acknowledged privately. The Marine Sulphur Queen became a cautionary reference rather than a case study. Its disappearance was cited obliquely, often without detail. The implication was clear. Whatever had happened, it was not something the industry wanted examined too closely. This lack of urgency to resolve contradictions fed suspicion. If the evidence was truly inconclusive, why not keep searching? Why not reopen the investigation as new theories emerged? Why allow such a unique disaster to be archived without resolution? The silence suggested discomfort, an awareness that a full explanation might expose systemic failures extending beyond a single ship. Over time, official interest waned. Files were closed, reports gathered dust. The ocean had claimed its dead, and institutions moved on. But the mystery of the disappearance did not dissolve with time. Instead, it hardened. The unanswered questions became more defined, more deliberate. And in the space left by authority silence, other voices began to emerge. Voices that had been overlooked, dismissed, or never formally recorded. Those voices would offer fragments of a different narrative, not answers, but perspectives, and together they would suggest that the story of the Marine Sulphur Queen was far from complete. In the absence of definitive answers, the mystery of the disappearance of the SS Marine Sulphur Queen began to survive in quieter places, in conversations never recorded, in statements softened before publication, and in recollections shared only years later. These accounts did not come from official briefings or final reports. They came from people who had brushed against the ship's history and walked away uneasy. Before we go any deeper into the mystery of the disappearance, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. These stories don't surface often, and when they do, they tend to disappear into silence, just like the SS Marine Sulphur Queen. If this case already feels unsettling, leave a like. It helps keep investigations like this visible. And while you're watching, think carefully. Do you believe this ship was lost to an accident, or was something far more complex unfolding beneath the surface? Share your theory in the comments. Sometimes the most disturbing answers come from the questions no one else asks. Former crew members who had sailed on the Marine Sulphur Queen before its final voyage described a vessel that felt wrong. Not broken, not visibly failing, but unpredictable. Some spoke of strange vibrations traveling through the hull, more pronounced than on comparable tankers. Others mentioned persistent odors, sulfurous, metallic, lingering in areas where they shouldn't have been. These details were rarely documented formally. At the time, they were dismissed as discomforts of a difficult cargo, not warnings of catastrophe. There were also accounts from dock workers and inspectors who remembered the ship as problematic. Maintenance issues were frequent. Temporary fixes became routine. The ship was operational, but always on the edge of tolerance. A few recalled hearing concerns about gas buildup and ventilation failures, issues that, if compounded at sea, could become deadly long before flames or explosions ever appeared. Family members of the final crew would later recall odd moments before departure. Some sailors had expressed reluctance about the voyage. Others made comments that in hindsight felt like premonitions. Complaints about the ship's behavior, jokes about its instability, casual remarks that now carry unsettling weight. None of this constituted evidence at the time, but collectively, these memories form a pattern of unease that contrasts sharply with the calm of the last official transmission. Perhaps most intriguing were the informal accounts from other mariners in the Gulf. A few reported unexplained radio interference that night. Brief static bursts, sudden drops in signal clarity, nothing conclusive, nothing logged as significant. But in a case defined by silence, even interference becomes suspicious. If something had gone wrong aboard the Marine Sulphur Queen, it may have disrupted more than just its own communications. These hidden testimonies do not solve the case. They complicate it. They suggest that the disappearance was not a singular, unforeseeable event, but the final outcome of long-standing issues that were normalized through repetition. A ship that always felt slightly unsafe eventually vanished, and only then did its past discomforts gain meaning. In the absence of official acknowledgement, these accounts became a parallel record, fragmented, subjective, but persistent. Together, they point toward a truth that was never formally recognized. The Marine Sulphur Queen may have been a disaster waiting for the right conditions to unfold. And when those conditions finally aligned, there was no time, no warning, and no voice left to describe what happened. To understand the mystery of the disappearance, investigators were forced to turn the Gulf of Mexico itself into a suspect. Without a wreck site, without coordinates of impact or sinking, the location of the Marine Sulphur Queen's final moments became fluid, defined not by certainty, but by probability. Several zones emerged as possibilities, each carrying its own implications. The primary focus rested along the ship's projected route, a corridor shaped by shipping lanes, currents, and the last confirmed transmission. This area, though heavily trafficked, is also deceptive. Beneath the surface lie deep channels, unpredictable current shifts, and areas where wreckage can sink quickly and never return. If the tanker suffered a catastrophic internal failure here, debris could have been scattered before any visible surface signature formed. Another possibility involved a deviation, intentional or forced, from the planned course. Heavy seas may have pushed the ship off track. Mechanical issues might have altered its heading. Even a subtle course correction, unreported and unnoticed, could place the vessel in a region where currents behave differently, dispersing debris in patterns that defy reconstruction. This could explain why recovered fragments appeared so far apart, refusing to align with a single origin point. Some analysts pointed toward deeper waters farther south, where the Gulf drops away sharply. In these zones, a vessel can descend rapidly, leaving little behind. If the Marine Sulphur Queen broke apart in stages, heavier sections may have sunk immediately, while lighter fragments surfaced days later, far removed from the actual site of destruction. This scenario aligns with the absence of large structural components and the lack of a concentrated debris field. There is also the unsettling idea that the ship may have remained afloat longer than assumed, drifting, compromised, and silent. A vessel slowly failing does not announce itself with a single location. It creates a moving disaster, shedding evidence over time and distance. In this case, the Gulf itself would have been erasing the timeline as it unfolded. Each potential location tells a different version of the story. A sudden internal catastrophe, a gradual structural collapse, a drifting, incapacitated ship doomed long before it finally disappeared. Without a confirmed site, none can be proven. And that uncertainty transforms geography into narrative. each place a chapter that might explain the impossible evidence already recovered. The Gulf of Mexico keeps its secrets well. Its size allows disasters to unfold unnoticed. Its currents rearrange truth. And in the case of the Marine Sulphur Queen, the sea did not just swallow a ship. It obscured the very place where answers might have been found, leaving the mystery of the disappearance unanchored and unresolved. When conventional explanations failed to close the case, deeper theories began to surface. Quietly at first, then with growing insistence. These were not the sensational speculations of conspiracy, but uncomfortable possibilities that challenged assumptions about safety, design, and human awareness. They emerged from the spaces where the mystery of the disappearance refused to be simplified. One theory centers on toxic gas accumulation. Molten sulfur releases hydrogen sulfide, a gas both lethal and deceptive. At low levels, it smells strongly of rotten eggs. At higher concentrations, it paralyzes the sense of smell entirely, creating the illusion of safety moments before unconsciousness. If ventilation systems failed or gas pockets formed within the ship, the crew could have been incapacitated silently, without fire, without panic, and without time to react. A ship filled with living men could become a drifting shell in minutes. Another theory examines thermal stress. The sulfur cargo required constant heating, creating extreme temperature differences within the vessel's structure. Over time, this stress could weaken steel in unpredictable ways. A sudden rupture in one of the cargo tanks might not explode outward, but inward, collapsing sections of the ship while releasing heat and gas unevenly. This would explain the contradictory evidence. Heat-damaged fragments alongside untouched steel. There is also the possibility of a cascading systems failure, power loss, ventilation failure, cargo instability, none fatal alone, but devastating together. In such a scenario, alarms might fail, lights could go dark, and confusion would spread faster than understanding. A crew trained to respond to emergencies might not recognize this as one until escape was no longer possible. What ties these theories together is not drama but silence. They all suggest events that unfold internally, invisibly, and fatally. No explosion loud enough to alert nearby ships, no distress call sent because there was no one left capable of sending it. These deep theories do not offer closure, they offer plausibility. And in a case defined by absence, plausibility is the closest thing to truth. The Marine Sulphur Queen may not have been destroyed by a single moment, but by a convergence, design compromises, hazardous cargo, and invisible failures aligning at exactly the wrong time. And if that is true, then this mystery of the disappearance is not just a maritime anomaly. It is a warning, one written in silence and paid for by 39 lives that vanished without a voice. With no wreck site to examine and no survivors to question, the final reconstruction of the SS Marine Sulphur Queen's fate must be assembled the way this entire mystery of the disappearance has been handled, from fragments, probabilities, and uncomfortable logic. It is not a declaration of what happened, but a sequence of what could have happened, based on everything that refuses to disappear from the record. In this reconstruction, the tanker enters the Gulf already compromised, not catastrophically, but subtly. Structural stress from years of carrying molten sulfur has weakened internal supports. Ventilation systems, strained and imperfect, struggle to keep up. The ship moves through heavy seas, each wave adding pressure to a hull that no longer distributes stress evenly. Inside the cargo tanks, heat and motion create conditions that are difficult to monitor and impossible to see. At some point during the night, something small goes wrong. Perhaps a ventilation failure, perhaps a thermal imbalance. Hydrogen sulfide begins to accumulate in confined spaces. The danger is invisible and, at first, unnoticed. Crew members on watch may feel dizzy. Judgment slows. Alarms, if triggered, are misunderstood or ignored. The smell fades, not because the danger has passed, but because the senses responsible for detecting it have shut down. As the gas spreads, coordination collapses. There is no sudden panic, no rush to the radio. The crew does not realize they are running out of time. Within minutes, key personnel may be unconscious. The bridge falls silent. The engines continue running, pushing the ship forward without command. The Marine Sulphur Queen becomes a moving vessel without a functioning crew. Then comes the structural failure. Weakened steel gives way under stress, possibly in multiple locations. Cargo tanks rupture unevenly. Heat escapes. Metal warps. Some sections break free early, others later. The ship does not explode. It disintegrates in stages. By the time it finally succumbs to the sea, there is no one left to abandon ship, no one left to call for help. Debris surfaces days later, scattered by currents that erase the timeline. Heat-damaged fragments drift alongside untouched steel. Sulfur residue appears in patches, not patterns. The ocean returns proof of destruction, but not explanation. And because the failure unfolded internally, quietly, and without witnesses, the reconstruction can never be confirmed, only inferred. This version of events aligns with the silence, the impossible evidence, and the absence of human response. It explains why the ship never asked for help, why nearby vessels heard nothing, why authorities struggled to settle on a cause. It does not offer certainty, but it offers coherence. In the end, the final reconstruction does not close the mystery of the disappearance. It frames it. It suggests that the Marine Sulphur Queen was not lost to chaos, but to a sequence so subtle and so lethal that it erased itself as it unfolded. The mystery of the disappearance of the SS Marine Sulphur Queen ends the way it began, with silence. No wreck to visit, no final message to analyze, no definitive answer to carve into history, just a name, a date, and 39 men who never came home. Over time, the case was filed away as an unfortunate maritime loss, its edges softened by technical language and probability. But unresolved mysteries do not fade. They wait. What makes this disappearance linger is not just what happened to one ship, but what it suggests about others. The Marine Sulphur Queen was not unique in its compromises. It was not the only vessel converted beyond its original design. It was not the only tanker carrying dangerous cargo through familiar waters under routine conditions. If this ship could vanish without warning, without a distress call, without witnesses, then how many others came close? Maritime history is filled with disappearances that echo the same pattern. Vessels lost in busy shipping lanes, crews gone without a signal, debris found but never enough. Each case treated as isolated, each explanation labeled inconclusive. But taken together, they form something harder to ignore. A pattern of silence, of internal failures that leave no voice behind. The Gulf of Mexico still carries the route the Marine Sulphur Queen once followed. Ships still pass through those waters, radios humming, crews trusting systems they cannot see. Somewhere beneath the surface, the remnants of that tanker may still lie, holding answers that were never retrieved. Or perhaps there is nothing left to find, only the lesson that some disasters erase themselves as they happen. Captain John C. McClelland and his crew did not vanish into legend. They vanished into procedure, into reports that avoided certainty, into a mystery of the disappearance that remains unresolved, not because it lacks clues, but because those clues arrived too late and spoke too softly. And that is the final, unsettling hook of this story. The SS Marine Sulphur Queen may not be an exception. It may be an example, a reminder that the most dangerous failures are not the loud ones, but the silent ones, the kind that unfold without panic, without warning, and without ever asking for help. If this ship could disappear in plain sight, then the question remains open, drifting like its debris once did across the Gulf. How many other disappearances have already happened, without anyone realizing it yet? If this story stayed with you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next investigation into real mysteries that were never solved. Leaving a like tells the algorithm these stories deserve to be heard, and leaving a comment keeps the mystery alive. What do you think really happened to the SS Marine Sulphur Queen? Was it a silent chain reaction, a design flaw waiting to happen, or something still unexplained? Write your theory below, because as long as people keep asking questions, these disappearances are never truly forgotten.